Time to get back to Fort Tarsis. 2-8 job, well done.
The only kind there is. I'm on my way.
The story of Anthem has been a subject of speculation and skepticism since the game was first announced as an online-only loot shooter action game and not a traditional RPG. BioWare has been known throughout its history as a story-first, player-choice-driven role-playing game developer, and so this new focus on multiplayer plus story was a major divergence, and many longtime BioWare fans braced themselves for the worst. Now that the game is out and I've played through the entire critical path and almost all of the side content, I can say with certainty it's not nearly as bad as some of us had initially feared, not even remotely as bad as some of the hyperbolic clickbait artists on YouTube say it is, and also not nearly as good as it could have been. And as a whole, not as good as the rest of the BioWare catalog. Hello and welcome to the Exalted March. Today we're going to talk about the story in Anthem, and I mean all of it. This is going to be an in-depth examination of Anthem's story from various angles, including premise, plot, characters, dialogue, etc. It will include spoilers for basically everything, including major spoilers and plot twists. I won't go through beat by beat exactly, but instead take a top-down view on what the story really is, conceptually, and then zoom in on certain characters, scenes, and even specific lines of dialogue to illustrate my observations with more concrete examples. And that's a really important point about concrete examples. I've absorbed a lot, probably dozens and dozens of hours of Anthem coverage, including coverage that claims to be about the story, and yet I've seen almost nothing that is actually useful in analyzing the story. Good, bad, or indifferent, the comments on the story that I'm mainly seeing always feel vague and non-specific. Things like, the story is lackluster, the story doesn't have teeth, the story doesn't click for me. And even some of the positive comments are things like, the lore is so interesting, but they don't say why, or I really like X character for some vague reason, like because I think they're cool. Whether you like it or not, what I'm really looking for is analysis that's in-depth and specific. I hate to start by complaining, but it's just amazing to me that so many people have reached a conclusion about Anthem's story and talk about this publicly, but they don't ever feel the need to actually give examples or argumentation for why they've reached that conclusion. Now, mind you, I'm not just talking about random Twitter comments. I mean actual reviews in publications from people who are presumably paid to write video game reviews. It's their prerogative to skip on the details if they want to, but only knowing the conclusion as a reader without knowing their essential rationale for how they got there essentially makes those reviews useless when it comes to determining whether or not the story is good or not. So this is an attempt to be far more thorough than that. This video will very likely be long, and you may want to watch it in pieces, that's fine. I'll try and include timestamps in the description below. But with that said, let's get started. The story in Anthem can be enjoyable, maybe even in its best spots you could go so far as to call it good, but it's definitely not great. And even good is being pretty forgiving if we're looking at some of the more challenged areas. If you're a longtime BioWare fan who lowered your expectations all the way to the floor, much like I did, you're probably going to be pleasantly surprised how much you actually like this story, and how much it reminds you of classic BioWare storytelling of the past. But you're also going to be disappointed, because it is ultimately only reminiscent of, and not indicative of, that old BioWare storytelling. Most likely, you'll only like this story, and not love this story. It tells the tale of a freelancer pilot trying to redeem him or herself along with the reputation of the freelancers generally, after a mission to save a city called Freemark goes horribly wrong. You team up with your guy-in-the-chair buddy Owen, and later on your old friends Faye and Halleck, who were also a part of the doomed mission 2 years ago. You're seeking to help citizens of Fort Tarsis, stop supernatural disturbances known as cataclysms, and contend against a domineering organization known as the Dominion, which aims to harness the Anthem of Creation, a vague, all-powerful energy some believe to be responsible for everything in existence. It's a story of good against bad, old friends getting past their differences, and people who dare to take on the mantle of hero, having to face their own mortality and shortcomings. It aims to be quintessential, but succeeds in being predictable instead. That still doesn't make it bad, but it does betray a lack of congruence in those behind the vision of Anthem's story. When you set out to tell a quintessential or archetypal story, you're starting with the understanding that you won't be treading on novel ground, at least not broadly. You're not setting out to tell the most unique story, you're setting out to trigger a resonant emotional truth that you believe is inherently inside of all of us. mapping out a macro-level truth that isn't readily identifiable in day-to-day life, but instead unmistakable when examining the hero's journey across cultures and time. You're probably doing this because you believe that it's important, and while it doesn't provide the same amusement as novelty does, it inspires and captivates us because some part of us knows that we need it. You're trying to further mythological tropes because they're useful to society in some way. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed or preachy either. If you're good at it, you can wrap these macro-level truths about self-sacrifice and bravery for the good of others into fun, relatable stories and make something like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. If you're bad at it, you're going to make a cheap knockoff of those stories and people are going to complain that you didn't even try to make something original. For a while now, I've suspected that Casey Hudson, Anthem's original creative director and now BioWare studio manager, is the type of person who likes quintessential stories. In order to understand why that is exactly, you'll need to listen to how he talks about the origins of Mass Effect, the effects of 1980s sci-fi movies, and specifically the 1986 movie Top Gun.
I think a lot of my early passions came from movies, and there would be things like Star Wars, and but also things like Top Gun and The Right Stuff. And it was, on the one hand, you know, what I loved about it was the idea of becoming those kinds of guys, you know, and having those kinds of jobs, really trying to do something that was very hard to do, that very few people were able to do, and really searching out that kind of achievement. And so I started to love, you know, aerospace and rockets and airplanes and stuff like that. But I also realized that part of what I loved about that was that they were great stories. And there was really great storytelling and really great imagery happening there. And I think, you know, I started realizing that much of what I was doing, in addition to learning about space and flying and stuff like that, much of what I was doing was actually trying to recreate those movies, you know, through little video games I was writing or you know, trying to write stories and stuff like that. So I think that became a lot of what I'm interested in now, which is not just the actual thing, but also creating the experience that I had in the entertainment side.
It's clear from this that Casey Hudson has spent a long time trying to create stories of rather atypical heroes, charging into dangerous and exciting situations and coming out on top. If you think about the Top Gun comparison, think about what it means to be a fighter pilot, then look at the freelancers in Anthem and how they ended up, it's not hard to see the comparison. Being a Javelin pilot is, in essence, like a science fiction superhero version of being a fighter pilot. You're charging into danger and doing what no one else can. You're defending the weak, taking it to the bad guys, going into enemy territory. There's plenty of science fiction type lore in Anthem under the surface, but it is deliberately under the surface. The main point of Anthem is clear. Fly fast, fire a huge artillery of weapons, look really cool, head straight for danger, and prevail against all odds. That type of story can work. I would actually argue that much of the original Mass Effect trilogy is something very much like that type of story. But in order for it to work, you really have to believe in it. If you're going to tell a story about a guy or a gal who flies around in a jetpack robot armor suit, shooting missiles or fireballs at monsters, and contends with an evil bad guy who is literally in a cape, trying to control the power of creation itself, you've got to lean into it. And I mean, you've got to lean all the way into it. And Anthem just doesn't. It's almost like Anthem's story was written by people who didn't really believe in it. Casey Hudson would have certainly had something to do with the original concepts and the broad story, but as studio manager now, or even as creative director back then, wouldn't have written the plot or characters directly. That would have been done by BioWare's larger writing staff. We know certain BioWare veterans like Mass Effect lead writer Drew Karpyshyn returned to contribute to the writing, but according to Karpyshyn himself, he worked a bit on the critical path and then upon the completion of his specific writing assignment, left BioWare for the second time. I won't go into specifics any further on who wrote what. My aim in this video is not to call out individual writers, but just to say that I get the distinct feeling that Anthem's premise was conceived of one way, and that execution was conceived of another way. I'm not saying the writers were actively trying to subvert the genre that they're writing in, which is essentially sci-fi fighter pilots in jet suits swoop in and save the day, but that they certainly weren't enthused about writing this kind of story, and that lack of enthusiasm shows. There are a few major instances of this incongruence between premise and story that we'll cover in today's video, but the first one I want to discuss is how the protagonist is depicted, and specifically their lack of any tangible growth. I'll talk a bit later on about the protagonist more generally, but one of the key elements lacking in Anthem's story is that lack of growth for the main player character. This isn't unusual for BioWare. Unfortunately, other protagonists in their games have also been relatively static, but that doesn't excuse the deficiency, ever. The protagonist, who I'll just refer to from now on as the Freelancer, is trying to come back from the opening story moment in the game where your team fails miserably and you almost die. The very next moment we see the Freelancer, it's 2 years later, you're in a busted up old javelin doing whatever contract you can get your hands on, and the reputation of your order, the Freelancers, is in total shambles. That clearly denotes that this is supposed to be a redemptive tale where you show what you're really made of and make up for the initial failing, thereby redeeming the reputation of the Freelancers as well. But how is that going to happen? In order for it to happen in a truly cathartic way, a protagonist should have to sacrifice something personal and transform themselves into more than who they were before in order to truly overcome past failures. But nothing like that really happens. You're supposed to be bringing together old friends in a community that feels like it's up against the ropes so that everyone can rise to the occasion and secure victory in what looks like a hopeless situation. But instead, you just sort of try again. Sure, I'm being reductive here slightly. There are some personal hurdles that you have to help your team overcome, but for the Freelancer, it never feels like we get them to transform into the hero they needed to be during the opening. That just sort of happens along the way. Speaking of your team, that's primarily composed of Halleck, a former Javelin pilot who hasn't been the same since the failure at Freemark, Faye, your old Cypher, and Owen, your new Cypher, where Cypher is basically your in-helmet tactical support. I found Halleck and Faye to both be compelling for different reasons, and looking back, they might have been my favorite part of the game because of their dynamic with each other. After Freemark, which was destroyed by a cataclysm known as the Heart of Rage, they each struggle and fall into despair. And refreshingly, unlike the Freelancer, they do grow throughout the story. But the price that they have to pay for that growth, their climb upward out of despair, is never given enough screen time to really let the player develop more empathy for them. It's there, certainly, but I think that the more the game had focused on their story, the more depth it would have had overall. Besides Halleck and Faye, you also have on your team your new Cypher, Owen. You spend a lot of time with Owen, either in person or with him living inside of your helmet, offering information and instruction on objectives out in the field. He's enthusiastic, upbeat, he tells jokes, he likes sandwiches, and aside from longing to complete his Lancer training and having a javelin of his own one day, he seems genuinely into the idea of being part of a dynamic duo. Owen keeps things from getting too lonely when you're flying missions solo and not playing with other players during the critical path. And in many ways, he's the first character in Anthem that I started to relate to in much the same way that you might relate to a crew member of the Normandy in Mass Effect 1 or a party member in Dragon Age. When you finish a mission, you come back to Fort Tarsis and chat with Owen for a bit about his backstory or your relationship. If you're out in the field, he might have a quip or two about what's going on, similar to party banter in other BioWare games. I was actually pleasantly surprised how much this dynamic with Owen functioned like a BioWare party member. Aside from our main team, we also have a primary antagonist called the Monitor, and here we run into a problem of incongruence between premise and execution, similar to the protagonist, but much worse. Whereas the Freelancer is simply one note and static, the Monitor is static and barely even noticeable in terms of personality and motivation. There is almost nothing worth summarizing about the Monitor, except for what wasn't done and should have been. The Monitor's claims are standard villainous fare. He claims that the power of the Anthem of Creation has destroyed civilizations, but that in his hands it can be used to put an end to the needless suffering of humanity. It's just that, also, he tends to cause a lot of suffering on the way to getting that power. He was the one responsible for the destruction of Freemark initially, burning the entire city to the ground in order to get his hands on an ancient artifact known as the Cenotaph, which was supposed to help him control the Anthem of Creation, but instead leveled the city. If all of this sounds generic, that's primarily because it is, but that's not the sole reason why a villain like this conceptually falls flat. Darth Vader and Voldemort are considered great villains, but they're not any less archetypal than the Monitor. In fact, they're probably more archetypal. The reason why the Monitor actually feels so boring is because there's no connection between the foundation of his aims and why they ultimately manifest. Essentially, what drives an antagonist seeking ultimate power, supposedly for the good of everyone, is a concern about order, a need to control in order to fulfill a need to protect. They're sure that the world is going to fall into unimaginable suffering across the board if things aren't made, if things aren't forced into being how they ought to be. And they know this, or they should, because of their own loss, because of deep, personal, agonizing loss. That's what drives them. The reason why the Monitor falls flat as a villain isn't just because his aims are sort of standard, it's because there's no driving force made up of personal loss connected to those aims. The real question that needed to be answered in writing the Monitor is, who hurt him? What did he lose? Who did he lose? Was it a child, a spouse, a parent, sibling, a dear friend? Maybe his entire civilization is one of the ones that was lost, but if so, it's never stated clearly that that's what's driving him. And that missing piece is crucial. If all he wanted was all the power so he can control everything, if we knew why, that would make him resonate so much more. But in lieu of an actual antagonist, we get an empty vessel in the Monitor, and something else too. Bonus antagonist. Okay, even though I said earlier this whole video would contain spoilers, we're really getting into spoilers territory, so stop here if you really want to avoid that and haven't beaten the game yet. Remember Owen, that fun-loving, likable sidekick character, your guy in the chair who's always wished that he could be the one out there flying around in a jet suit of armor and being the hero? Well, apparently Owen skipped the day in class when they went over ethics in Javelin training because his concept of hero is a bit backwards. Turns out Owen is a surprise villain in the game, betraying you at a critical moment and stealing what appears at that time to be the only way to stop the Heart of Rage. It's a twist that has the desired effect of shock and disbelief and feeling of betrayal, but only for the briefest of moments. And I mean really brief, and I mean literally moments. I was shocked for all of about 10 seconds or so before I went, huh? Owen. That guy? The guy who likes, and I'm not joking here, free sandwiches? Never mind the how of it all. That is suspect from a technical level, but that's still nothing that you can't get past with a little suspension of disbelief. The real curious angle to discuss is why. In essence, Owen is meant to represent the anger and frustration of someone who wishes that they could be in the limelight, who believes that they would do so much good, but just isn't really cut out for it, or at least not yet. That anger apparently festered for a long time, and finally Owen saw his opportunity. In this particular part of the story, you're trying to retrieve an ancient, powerful javelin suit with the necessary shielding technology to enter into the Heart of Rage safely, but Owen swoops in at the last second, disables your javelin suit, and then takes the super-powered javelin for himself. The problem with this betrayal manifesting so suddenly is, even if it's technically supported by the previous character setup, the way that they played his frustration prior to this moment was so lighthearted as to be mainly taken as comedic relief. Part of the problem here could be that the writers were dead set on depicting Owen in a way that would not telegraph the plot twist whatsoever. But in trying to obfuscate the twist, they fail to properly lay the foundation for the motivation of Owen's betrayal. It's surprising for a moment, but not in a I never saw it coming, wow, sort of way, but more like a, really? That guy? Sort of way. Honestly, if I had seen any betrayal coming, I thought it would have been Halleck. He's still angry at you for pulling him out of the failed mission to save Remark, even though you saved his life. He wanted to go down fighting, or maybe in his mind really thought he could pull it off even though everyone else was dead. He's struggling with his reduced role fighting the Dominion, and maybe jealousy would get the better of him, and he thinks that it should be him in the Dawn Guard armor. I'm not saying it would have been great, or even my preference for Halleck specifically, but it would have made more sense than Owen. Only it wouldn't have been as surprising. And that's really the disappointing part, is that BioWare played Owen's betrayal for how surprising it could be, and not how well set up it is. Another element of Incongruence is the collection of characters that you can get to know in Fort Tarsis. And this is a big one. It might be one of the primary touchpoints we can look to really see where Anthem's high-level vision diverges from its ground-level execution. And before I continue, I'll just say I really liked a lot of these characters in a totally subjective BioWare fan kind of way. Many of them are quirky, funny, well-acted, and yes, unique. If you just zoom in on them individually, they're enjoyable in a spill your guts and make friends with a random hero wandering around the city kind of way that BioWare characters are. It's not to say that it's not worth criticizing given how more subtle character interactions are getting in newer games, but the classic, if heavy-handed approach to character building we've known from earlier BioWare games won't bother most longtime fans in Anthem either. It's not just that, though. It's that Fort Tarsis and all its inhabitants are supposed to be in dire straits. And the player is supposed to be on a harrowing journey of self-sacrifice to save them. But you would never guess that from talking to them. While there are some interactions centering around loss and struggle in the world of Anthem, generally the colorful and unique approach in characters rarely grapples with the larger struggle, and their lives seem mostly mundane. What Tarsis really needed wasn't more unique, quirky characters, but meaningful plot lines around the survival of the city not necessarily linked to the critical path. They establish in the lore that Lancers don't directly hunt or secure food, but what about fuel sources and power sources? What about direct incursions from the outlaws trying to get into the city that you could stop? At one point earlier on, you do go out into the open world to collect a crafting material, Ember, for a character named Prospero in the market, but that feels much more like a fetch quest to unlock the DLC store than meaningful narrative. I was hoping more for, we need you to go out into the world and bring back this thing or everyone in the city is going to die. Not go get some crafting rocks so you can have the option to buy the gum on shoe emote from the microtransaction store. There should have been one or more direct storylines directly related to the defense of Tarsis specifically, or to venturing out into the wilderness and bringing something back that has a major visual and story change to Tarsis. There were some really good premises for side plots in Tarsis. One of them involves a defector who is a former Dominion intelligence agent. He's having a hard time adjusting to his new life in Tarsis, and his wife initially approaches you to see if you can maybe just talk to him. He seems to carry some guilt about his former life and the things that he's done, including torture and murder. But after getting to know him in multiple conversations, you learn he isn't actually a real defector at all. He's a sleeper agent, programmed to activate inside of Fort Tarsis to complete an objective, and he has no memory or awareness of this at all unless activated by a code word. This presents an interesting dilemma, as his cover persona is a fully realized separate personality, genuinely in love with his wife and committed to helping fight the Dominion, but his sleeper agent persona still lurks just under the surface. The game lets you choose to support him in his new life under the supervision of his wife, who is also an intelligence agent on your side, or turn him over to another character, Tassin, for punishment. If turned over for punishment, you can advise that he either be imprisoned or banished from the city. For a game that at times seems totally content to make Fort Tarsis about light-hearted conversations and distractions, I was pleasantly surprised by this moral dilemma appearing. While this isn't the only Tarsis interaction that I liked, the ones with real depth are too few overall. You have discussions with the custodian of Fort Tarsis, the bartender, the bar owner, a crazy crafting merchant named Sarna, and many others, but rarely do you land on an interaction with emotional resonance or major plot relevance. These interactions are optional, and they're there mostly for color. This would be forgivable and even laudable from so many other developers, but for BioWare, a company known for great stories and great character conversations, it feels like a bittersweet reminder of what we're missing. Speaking of what we're missing, let's go on to another major issue in Anthem, besides just the incongruence between premise and story. And that is the problem of perspective. And by that, I mean first-person perspective. This is unique to your out-of-Javelin gameplay, but seeing as how most of the story is out of the Javelin, this is highly relevant, in particular to story. Games that are predominantly first-person have had great success in the realm of storytelling, from System Shock to Deus Ex to Half-Life and Portal to BioShock and Halo. First-person shooters and RPGs have traditionally not been inherently hindered by putting the player into first-person during most or all of the storytelling moments, and even had special kinds of success by locking you into the immersive perspective from behind the character's eyes. Yet here, Anthem struggles. We needed to be able to see the freelancer. Not seeing them, and also not having enough harrowing moments of immersion in first person, leaves us feeling disconnected from this protagonist. We don't see their face, their emotion, we don't see them in this world interacting with it during the story moments in Tarsis, and so empathy becomes hard to come by. The freelancer isn't really a character that you play or relate to in the same way that you do with Shepard in Mass Effect or Hawk in Dragon Age. But you're also not able to express yourself thoroughly enough as the freelancer to really feel like you are the character. This is where BioWare's use of binary dialogue system fails to support your ability to successfully roleplay. Whereas in past BioWare games you may have had several choices in a dialogue tree or dialogue wheel, here you have two. Every conversation is made up of binary dialogue choices that typically group into the more optimistic on the left side and the more pragmatic on the right side. Not exactly the moral black and white of the Paragon Renegade dichotomy, but whereas Mass Effect suffered from being occasionally binary in that way, Anthem is exclusively binary, just more subtle in the actual dialogue. And the system actually works better than you'd expect. Despite seeming limited on the surface, you do feel the distinction between the choices offered and feel like you're able to pick between the two offered personas. I like to take risk, or playing it safe keeps you alive. I'm always happy to get out into the field, or I'm just doing my job. Yes, Amal, go ahead and sleep with that married woman, or say no and set firm boundaries. Unlike Mass Effect Andromeda, where you often felt like you had 4 different styles to say substantially the same thing, in Anthem, most of the dialogue choices do feel substantially different from one another. The dialogue system itself isn't inherently the problem, but rather the lack of ambition in showcasing just how much complexity you can get from only having 2 variables. That's the problem. Anyone familiar with Boolean algebra will tell you that having a binary isn't limiting to complexity, but that it's all about how you use it. And here BioWare fails to truly express all the different variations possible because the writing isn't daring enough. Had they committed to truly making the outcomes of conversations wildly different based on your choices, even 2 branches of 2 choices each could lead to exciting storytelling and dramatically different roleplays. But the outcomes of conversations aren't wildly different. They're, most of the time, slightly different. Sometimes you do return to that character to find out how your conversation previously had influenced them and what effect it had, and that's pretty satisfying. But you also realize that most of these interactions are limited to just this character. It rarely feels connected to anything else happening in Tarsis or the wider world. Now, there are exceptions to this that are quite enjoyable and rewarding. For instance, one character in the marketplace is having a hard time selling a new agricultural system that she's developed, and more than likely she's going to go broke. Now, before I had ever met her, I met a different woman in the bar who had previously owned a bakery that was now out of business, and she was trying to drink her problems away. Through talking to both of these women and encouraging them both in different ways, you can ultimately lead them to enter into business together, which works well for the both of them and presumably has great implications for the economy and food supply in Fort Tarsis. There's no significant visual element, which would have been nice, but the story implications are quite good. You relate to people personally, you exhort them, you sometimes empathize, and your other interactions and other characters come into play, and ultimately you lead people to work together for the good of Tarsis. This was a really enjoyable side story, but I can't help but wonder why there weren't way more like this in Anthem. And that's ultimately the problem with Tarsis NPCs, the problem with your character's roleplay, and the problem with conversations in general with Anthem. They don't feel connected, impactful, and personal enough. They do feel somewhat impactful. Technically, you have a distinction in choices, and there are some instances of interconnectedness, but they are too few, and unfortunately, mostly underwhelming. This leaves the freelancer in an odd sort of limbo among BioWare protagonists, not enough of a character to compete with the likes of Shepard or Hawk, but without enough roleplay options to compete with, say, the hero of Ferelden in Dragon Age Origins. Beyond just the implications on protagonist empathy and role-playing, there's a certain cinematic aesthetic lost by committing to an exclusively first-person view anytime you're outside of the Javelin. Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda, for whatever flaws they have in their stories, had multiple moments of strong cinematic aesthetic that draw the viewer into those worlds. By composing a frame in a dramatic, visually appealing way, you draw a viewer or a player in. If you're stuck to a first-person perspective, you're not able to maneuver as freely with cinematic techniques. However, you can still draw players in. The Metro series and BioShock franchise are great at doing this from the first-person perspective, mainly owing to the construction of strong, scripted sequences in the first person that either places you as the viewer of some spectacle, or perhaps even does something physically to the player that makes them arrested in the moment. You can't help but feel like you're in the shoes of the character because of the intensity of what's going on. Whether it's the infamous Would You Kindly moment, Cohen's masterpiece, the good ending involving the Dark Ones in Metro Last Light, or the opening moments in Metro Exodus when RTM is left for dead, when you offer an absolutely striking moment visually or put the player into an incredibly harrowing experience, the first-person perspective can absolutely shine as a storytelling device. There is one instance of this in Anthem, which I thought was reasonably well done, and that's when you're in the Fortress of Dawn completing a series of trials to prove your worthiness, when suddenly you're no longer in your javelin and experiencing a vision of your own past. This was a moment where I was totally involved in the story, and the switch to first person worked well. But again, this is another example that can be cited by itself with a real need for more of this sort of thing that we just don't get. Another brief note on perspective, games like Deus Ex or more recently Kingdom Come Deliverance split the difference between keeping the player in first person at all times during gameplay, but switch to a cinematic third person view during conversations. I quite like this approach as it allows for immersion while exploring and fighting, but also allows for more empathy while taking the protagonist through conversations. So again, first-person games are not inherently bad for role-playing or storytelling, as obviously there have been many successes in the past. But this was BioWare's first attempt at first-person, and it shows. If they can amend their approach and add some of the elements I've outlined, and even just increase some of what they've already done, this could be something that they do with success down the road. The next major point I wanted to discuss is the incongruence between the setting/story and the gameplay. While I'm talking at length about story, that's not the majority of what you spend your time on in Anthem. In Anthem, you spend more time shooting, smashing things, using powers, and flying around than anything else. Anthem is, at its core, a power fantasy and gameplay. But that is strangely at odds with the quintessential story that it's trying to tell, which is ultimately one of vulnerability in a chaotic and dangerous world. Anthem is a story of struggle and an impossible journey made to save a people already down and out, combined with the gameplay of a power fantasy, and those two things never reconcile. Primarily, they never reconcile because the power fantasy gameplay is so damn fun. It works really well and is the core of the experience. If it sounds like I'm down on Anthem at all, that's really just the focus on being as objective as possible about its story, but as a video game, I have enjoyed the heck out of Anthem. The powers are amazing to watch and satisfying to use, especially when triggering combos. Flying feels better than any other jetpack game ever created, and still hasn't gotten boring at any time. The combat is challenging but fun. It's hard to criticize the power fantasy of Anthem taken on its own because it's so well executed, but it is truly at odds with the story and the setting. The setting is meant to be one of peril. The physical setting of Anthem is at a place called Bastion, which is supposed to be a wildland, with Fort Tarsis as the only remaining settlement in the region. Wild monsters roam about. The mysterious insectoid hive mind creatures known as scars are increasing in number, and the Dominion is ever encroaching further and further into your territory. It's not safe to leave the city, and morale is down inside the city. Anthem tries to paint a bleak picture following the destruction of Freemark, which is impactful as far as setup goes, but then follows it up with combat in a game world that makes you feel invincible. In a shooter like Metro Exodus, this is totally the opposite. Every time you leave your home base, a train called Aurora that your squad is using as a mobile operating center, you feel vulnerable. It's a harrowing experience just to go explore and scrounge for supplies. You feel successful just for scathing off death a couple of times. Any attack is a real threat. And most importantly, you're filled with a real sense of relief as soon as the Aurora is back in sight. You really feel attached to that train and your crew members because there's a real safety and comfort associated with home base. Tarsis could have had that. The people in Tarsis could have represented that too if they were actually talking about the business of surviving in such a world. I'm not saying that Anthem needed to switch genres exactly because Metro Exodus is a very different thing overall, a survival shooter that at times feels like a horror game. But other examples do exist. Pillars of Eternity by Obsidian does a great job in a CRPG setting of making exploration feel rewarding but also risky, as you need to manage party members' health and stamina well enough to keep them alive, and reserve your camping supplies for when you need them the most. Or perhaps more notably, The Division, which operates directly in the same genre as Anthem, did a great job of making you feel like the world was inhospitable and that the safety of your main base was actually something that mattered. I never spent enough time with The Division to truly analyze it in depth, but I would at least say two things contributed to this feeling of appreciation for your base and the perilousness of the world. First, it's the continuity of a true open world. There's no loading screen coming into base. When you're a block away, you can see it. You can walk into it. I don't know exactly why, but this feeling of walking in always feels satisfying. You're coming home, in a sense. Second, trash mobs are a bit more of a threat. Now, this can be a negative depending on who you ask, but if you're randomly attacked in the Division, at least at a low level and according to my memory, it can be a real threat. Maybe this is totally a non-issue at higher levels, but I remembered this being a thing when I played. I felt exposed out on those cold, dilapidated New York streets. You don't feel like a superhero. You feel like a special operative, sure, but not superhuman. I don't think Anthem needs to abandon its superhero feel or disrupt its core gameplay mechanics. The combat in flying feels great, even Anthem's worst critics will readily admit this. But they could add a couple of elements that would retain the feeling of being a superhero while still adding to a sense of peril and challenge in an immersive way. Number one, they need to have the suits themselves take real damage and require repair after missions. This would add real depth to the gameplay, but also fashion a more personal narrative attachment between you and your javelin. As your suit becomes more damaged, you would take minor stat degradation, but with upgrades to armor and shielding, you could minimize this over time. Actually seeing the suit take damage would look cool, but also give you a sense of satisfaction upon repair. Furthermore, it reminds you, in keeping with the setting, you're not invulnerable, and your great feats out in the field are a marvel of engineering and diligence, not actual superpowers. Number two, and this one will be slightly more controversial, is that there ought to be more of an attachment to weapons you obtain in the game. The loot shooter genre, despite being all about gear earned, isn't really conducive to this. In loot shooter games, you obtain gear, then you obtain better gear, then even better gear, and so on and so forth. Especially in games with high roll chances, you're going to get better gear constantly, which I understand for fans of the genre, that's a must, that's what draws them to it. However, this does have somewhat of an impact to story, even though you might think it doesn't matter to story at all. But in video games, story isn't just about plot and characters and theme, it's about immersion and constructing everything the player does to be resonant with the world you've built. In Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, I didn't just feel attached to my horse or my hat, I felt attached to my Schofield revolver because it was truly mine. I customized it, I had to clean it so it worked at its best, and in Red Dead Redemption 2, you actually begin to earn stat boosts the longer you use a weapon, as a way of mimicking familiarity with that piece of equipment. I loved this feature. It not only made the best gear better, it incentivized growing attached to your weapons, much like your horse. I wouldn't mind seeing a similar stat boost to the javelin you use most often, or the weapons that you use the most in Anthem. God of War is another instance where attachment to a weapon is supported through gameplay. You keep the main weapon you start with for the entirety of the game, but it feels, looks, and plays differently depending on how you customize it throughout. Everyone has the same axe, but everyone's axe is a little different, and that makes you feel attached to it. You begin to associate the gear with the moments you've made it through with that gear. Whether it's ships in Star Citizen, guns or horses in Red Dead Redemption 2, or the axe in God of War, this is a phenomenon that I think is really growing in gaming, and it's a great, subtle, immersive way to boost story impact through general gameplay. Generally speaking, story impacting gameplay or vice versa feels disconnected in Anthem. In one instance, a narrative moment leads to the creation of a key piece of javelin technology, but it only amounts to a temporary armor slot that literally does nothing to gameplay, and is only ever evidenced as cutscene magic. It doesn't materially affect anything in gameplay, and is never thoroughly explained through a science fiction standpoint, so it is therefore a MacGuffin. It's hard to think of a single instance in Anthem in which a story event creates a unique aspect of gameplay or introduces a one-off gameplay design. The effects of the Anchor becoming disrupted in Inquisition's Trespasser DLC, or Ryder's link with Sam being severed in Andromeda, are recent examples of BioWare understanding how to do narrative design the right way, so this absence in Anthem is especially disappointing. Gameplay and story incongruence aside, the story by itself in Anthem isn't that bad. It's predictable, but that doesn't make it bad. The problem is that when it struggles quite mightily, and where it never shines often or bright enough. It can be a good story, but not for more than a couple of scenes at a time. Rather than go through just the highlights and lowlights or a general recap of the plot, I'm going to talk about the story structurally, then talk about certain characters and some particular moments that worked versus those that didn't. The biggest issue in general with the plot has to do with the second act. The second act in any story is one in which there should be a rising tension as the hero contends against antagonistic forces, both internal and external, and hopefully the building blocks of significant change in his or her personality are starting to be placed so that there can be an appropriate amount of growth or transformation later on that allows them to finally succeed. This important structural piece of storytelling is mostly absent in Anthem. There simply isn't enough meaningful conflict in the second act. Once you reunite with Halleck and Faye, the aim of obtaining Helena Tarsis' old javelin to pierce the heart of rage becomes clear, but the quests you go on feel lackluster until you actually reach the ancient javelin and are then faced with Owen's betrayal. In particular, a significant chunk of time in the second act is spent getting into tombs around the open world to obtain items needed for Faye's solution to reach the Dawnguard javelin. You do this by completing open-world gameplay challenges instead of completing a traditional quest. This was highly controversial for a lot of people because it felt like typical loot shooter grind in place of what should have been meaningful story content. While I didn't find this section overly hard or time-consuming the way that others did, it is counterproductive to the pacing due to being placed at a key portion of the plot when the main aim of the protagonist is just taking shape. Anthem's story also needed more peril before the climax and a greater feeling of dread or defeat before the last battle. Owen's betrayal was meant to represent that moment of defeat, but it felt more curious than anything. Why was Owen so successful at undermining everything anyway? Did he truly undermine everything? It really wasn't much of a momentary defeat since he ends up reversing his decision to oppose you rather quickly. I felt like I was questioning the choice of Owen's betrayal more than feeling the hopelessness of a pre-climax peril that you would expect. If you compare Anthem to Mass Effect 1, after Vermeer and before Ilos, Caden or Ashley is dead, Saren got away, half of the Solarian STGs are dead, you detonated a nuclear explosion on a garden world, the Council is furious with you, your ship is grounded, and as the first human Spectre ever, you are looking and feeling like a total failure. That low point is really resonant. And then the escape on the Normandy and the arrival at Ilos leading up to the Mako drop and the chase for Saren really feels like a rousing last-minute comeback. Anthem doesn't come anywhere close to that. Not anywhere close to being that low of a low or that high of a high. Overall, the plot of Anthem is serviceable, if a little bit by the numbers. I really don't think it's the thing to complain about if you're going to complain, but likewise it's not the standout in the story equation overall. Where I think Anthem really shines, and also at times really disappoints, is with its characters. Halleck and Faye are the standouts here. Both of these characters I liked a lot. Owen is also really good. His betrayal feels like it could have been set up better, but the first half of his story as your faithful sidekick plays beautifully. And even after the betrayal, there are moments worth paying attention to. But beyond this trio of Halleck, Faye, and Owen, many of the characters end up being forgettable. In some cases, it's because they're conceptually too far away from the events of the story, but in other cases, it's simply because they are under or misused. Before we get to those ancillary characters, however, let's start by looking at our primary trio. Halleck is a strong character overall. He has the feel of a normal guy who has tasted what it's like to be a hero for a few moments in his life, but is struggling to come to grips with the fact that those moments are fleeting, and that mostly he's just a man, weak and exposed like anyone else. His flaws, his vulnerability, and his exposed, bruised ego are compelling and at times gut-wrenching to watch. I would have liked to see more complexity woven into his character through adding more backstory and motivation, expanding on what other trauma and loss he's experienced beyond just what happened at Freemark. He seems like a guy who carries a lot on the inside, despite also being expressive at times. I wanted to explore more about his relationship with those other two Lancers shown dying in the game's opening scene. Was he the one who recruited them to be freelancers in the first place? Did he train them? What did they learn from him? Did they repeat any of his mistakes? Should he have been harder on them? Or maybe was he too hard on them? Had he had an argument or falling out with one of them before the Freemark mission, and do those harsh final words now haunt him? What about other failures before Freemark? Who was he growing up? Did he like himself? If being a freelancer is all he's ever been good at, which is implied, what was his life like before being a Lancer? What else is lacking in his life? We don't see him with any other friends or a romantic partner or family. Are Faye and the Freelancer really all he has? He also drinks heavily on at least one occasion, as seen in one side interaction at the Tarsis bar. I would have liked to know if that's a struggle for him, or just some rare, well-earned revelry. Overall, I liked how normal and flawed Halleck is, and my real criticism is that he doesn't get more screen time so we can explore more of his character. Faye is the other half of the duo, but in reality, she's probably the first half. Faye keeps the team together. She's the glue holding it all in place many times, both with sound plans for the mission at hand, but also an understanding of what everyone else's emotional needs are. She's empathic and smart, and highly likable. Part of her likability comes from the writing, sure, but the real thing that sends Faye over the top is the performance. Faye is played by Rochelle O'Neal, an actress who has appeared in several TV shows but never before in a video game, at least not that I could find. This is immediately apparent to anyone who has an eye for acting when watching any of her mocapped scenes. Neal has something that is so often lacking in video game cinematics: camera presence. She's visible in a way that goes past simply being on camera. Her expressiveness, her body language, her experience of being Faye is so present when you watch her that she literally steals scenes that she's in. In one moment, when Owen is feeling dejected after finding out he's not really part of the plan Faye just came up with, each of the characters is side by side, and you'd expect your eyes go towards the guy who is clearly having the more emotional experience. But Faye's subtle glance at Owen, just waiting for him to dismiss himself, is so brilliant and just over the top enough that you know it was a deliberate choice. If you get a chance, go back and watch that scene, paying special attention to Neal's performance. Much like my criticisms on how Halleck was handled, I really only want to ask for more here. I loved watching Faye and wish we had so much more of her as a character. I described her as the glue that keeps the team together, and while that's true, you have to wonder, what price does she pay for that? What toll does it take on her? We see it a bit in the game, particularly towards the end, but I would have liked to know more about her personal struggle. It's said in a conversation with Owen that every cipher is a little broken. If that's true, what fracture lay beneath the surface for Faye? How is she broken, and how does she cope with that? Could the player help her in some way? Rochelle O'Neal has recently tweeted out that she's back in the booth working on more Anthem content, so perhaps in future stories added through what's been promised to be free DLC, we will learn even more about Faye as a person. Owen rounds out the trio of main characters, and while most of the attention will be placed on his eventual betrayal later on in the game, Owen as a character before that is really quite good. At the beginning of the game, he was my early favorite as a character, and I still enjoy him as a character quite a bit. He's delightfully cheerful, but not in a way that's overly saccharine. He can be sarcastic, but he's never overly biting. He's loyal, but he's not subservient. And he has his own goals and dreams. He makes for a great buddy character and a fine companion presence, out on missions, even if he's not physically there. His exuberance is infectious and endearing, and even when it's played as being a little over the top, for instance, in a scene early on when Owen and the freelancer first meet with the Corvus agent Tassin, the reaction from other characters is appropriate. Owen is a little too gung-ho for his own good, but they play this appropriately, including his first ill-advised jump into a javelin suit around the game's midpoint. While I like Owen as a character, it's the plot twist around his character that is problematic. While the motivation is there and set up early, it never seems like Owen has it in him to be so ruthless. And even if he does, it never explains how he was so good at maintaining the subterfuge all this time if his entire persona was a facade. The gut punch works briefly as a surprise, but as the player is left to reflect, it becomes clear that the twist is a little forced. It could have been slightly better if actual player choice was involved. For instance, if there was a moment where you could actively encourage him to continue his Lancer training or crush his dreams, and this resulted in his betrayal or not. But even that would have felt a little contrived. The motivation for him doing this never feels thorough enough. There's something there when it comes to his betrayal, certainly. A person who is marginalized and thought of as not having what it takes to be on the front lines grows resentful. It's a known motif, but his dialogue needed to express this frustration, this rage, more in order for us to really feel it. As I said earlier, it's a twist that only surprises for a moment, and once that fades, you're only surprised about the choice the writers made, and you're not convinced that the character really made a naturalistic choice at all. There are a variety of other characters in the game, mostly made up of the inhabitants you talk to in Fort Tarsis. I'm not going to delve deeply into each one, but briefly I thought I'd give a thought or two about the ones that I felt most worthy of commentary. Tassin is probably my favorite character outside of the core trio. She's an agent for an intelligence agency called Corvus. She's direct, stern, but not entirely cold when you get to know her. She seems willing and perhaps even eager to try and build bridges, to get to know the freelancer. I like that there are allusions to her being more than just a spy, but there isn't nearly enough of that depth. And worse, later on in the story, she becomes conspicuously absent in a way that's never really explained. She just drops out of the picture and then pops back up again right before the climax. Matthias, a scholar archetype known as an arcanist, feels like he's meant to make more of an impact than he does. We spend plenty of time with Matthias, and he's referenced often, but he seems to be more a function of the plot, often delivering exposition, rather than displaying meaningful character growth. When he does talk about his background, growing up in a tough place, I was interested, but it's brief, and then right back to more exposition and lore explanation. Yarrow is an old Javelin pilot turned freelancer mentor. He starts to feel a bit one-note and repetitive. Also, I don't like the choice that they made for his voice, as he was clearly instructed to sound vaguely stiff and oddly Russian. This is especially true in a rather important expositional cutscene that he narrates. He could have been a pretty useful character otherwise. Lucky Jack is a fellow freelancer who is jovial, decently acted, and seems entirely unnecessary. Wraith, another freelancer, is funny and weird and also not really there for much. Zoe, the resident Fort Tarsis javelin mechanic, is interesting in how much she cares about the javelins and the comfort of the pilots. She also talks about her family, which I thought added depth to her character. She mentions a couple of times that her son wants to grow up and become a freelancer himself, but then that storyline just drops off unexplained. Amal is the local bartender, played by Jack McBrayer. Amal is weird but funny, even if his interactions are wildly out of place and random. I like Jack McBrayer as an actor, and there is one particular line, one amazing delivery by McBrayer that made me laugh out loud twice. Once when I experienced it during Anthem's demo, and again in the full game. I'm not sure what Amal's real point is, and he feels seriously out of place in the world of Anthem, but on some level, who cares? McBrayer crushes it with his performance, and the character is amusing enough. Sarna, the merchant for crafting materials, is similarly kooky and fun, but also kind of jarring in how different she is tonally from the rest of the world. Here, Kristen Schaal does a great job acting, but again, it feels like something written to display the actor's natural strengths in comedic performance rather than adding to the core themes of the story. So many of the characters in Anthem, while unique and expressive, feel like they're competing with each other, and even with the main plot, for attention. It's not that they aren't amusing or attention-grabbing on their own, but that they don't seem to mesh well with the setting or the overall narrative. This is unfortunately becoming a repeating trend in BioWare games, a fan-centric goal to make the best character in the game, which leads to all the characters feeling out of this world and oh so unique. Characters feel like one-off writer creations because they are. They are created from conceptualization to actual dialogue writing as unique entities meant to be as unique as possible, never mind if they actually serve the story or not. They all feel like short story protagonists from their own stories jammed into one big story where none of them are given proper time or setting to truly shine. These characters aren't bad writing individually, but they are really bad writing collectively. A big piece where these characters stick out and feel unnatural is in the dialogue. A lot of the dialogue in Anthem feels like a conversation between the writer and themselves, not like a conversation between two real people. This is starting to happen more and more in BioWare games, but has always been present in varying degrees. The dialogue feels expository first, character-driven, or aesthetic second. The question, does this sound real and authentic, seems to be often supplanted by the question, does this communicate to the player what they need to know? And that prioritization of exposition over authenticity is a detriment to the story. Both questions are important, but by placing the question of authenticity first, it establishes that you're in a believable world first as a given. This place and these characters act and sound and feel real. Whether or not they're a part of a plot that you can follow may be up to how good you are at reading subtleties and inferences, versus these characters are part of a plot that is unmissable, but whether or not you perceive them as being naturalistic depictions of real people is down to how much you can suspend disbelief or appreciate pantomime depictions of otherwise good characters. For instance, a good character premise is the woman in Tarsis who mistakes you for her son or daughter who died years earlier, but she can't come to grips with the fact that he or she is dead. It's a great concept and offers a meaningful player choice, but the dialogue is stilted, on the nose, and almost describes the problem directly rather than depicting it naturally. No matter how good your setting, premise, plot, or character arcs, dialogue is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and so often what we're experiencing in a story is through people talking. that has to resonate as natural and believable even when, or maybe especially when, it's dealing with the fantastical. Here, like parts of Inquisition and so much of Andromeda, BioWare still needs to significantly improve. There's one character, one quest, and quest chain that is indicative of the bad dialogue problem, but also serves as an example of bad writing overall. And I cannot stress this enough. I'm not just saying subpar writing or a character that I don't care for. I mean, it's bad. I'm talking about Sentinel Dax, who you meet in Fort Tarsis, and specifically a quest called Mysterious Beginnings. Sentinel Dax has a quest chain revolving around her quest to find out what happened to her aunt and others who have disappeared in a region called the Emerald Abyss. It's an entirely fine story premise on its own, but the haphazard antics of Sentinel Dax, played for laughs, never land as comedic and can come off as grating and strange. At the start of the Mysterious Beginnings quest, you're supposed to meet Dax at a particular location near the Emerald Abyss to start the investigation. But she's not there. She makes an excuse for why, but then says it doesn't matter because she can direct you to a nearby camp and, quote, walk you through it. Now, at this point, we still don't know exactly what we're doing. We know we're investigating, but we don't know what that entails, so when Dax says she can walk you through it, it's not clear what she even means or why we didn't start at this camp to begin with. In any event, you go to the camp, fight some bad guys, find a data cache, do the thing where you have to stay in the green circle while fighting bad guys so Faye can chime in to say that you've learned you need to travel to another camp. While you're going to the other camp, you intercept a radio signal that sounds like outlaws getting killed by some creatures, and then Dax says, we need to go there because that's the spot. When you ask why, she says bafflingly, we're not looking for outlaws, we're looking for a cipherlink. Now, just pause for a second. At no point in this quest was it ever made clear that we were looking for outlaws. I never thought we were looking for outlaws per se, just investigating disappearances, which sounded supernatural in nature, and somehow related to the Anthem of Creation anyway, not outlaws. And then Dax says, we're not looking for a thing that I never thought we were looking for in the first place. We're looking for a cipherlink. Okay, sure, fine. Why are we looking for a cipherlink? Well, just listen for yourself.
I thought we were trying to solve the mystery of people vanishing in the Emerald Abyss.
We are.
Then why am I in a creepy cave looking for a cipherlink?
Because the signal directed us here and...
No, I mean, how is this link connected to the Emerald Abyss?
Oh, it has intel on it.
Oh, what intel?
Important intel.
Dax!
Look, if I had all the answers, it wouldn't be a mystery.
If I had all the answers, it wouldn't be a mystery. If I had all the answers, it wouldn't be a mystery. That is the stupidest, laziest writing I have ever witnessed in a BioWare game, ever. That is dumber than anything Liam ever said. That is dumber than the stupid hydroponics protesters in Mass Effect Andromeda. That is a worse line of dialogue than Make or No from Sebastian in Dragon Age 2. Jacob showing up in Mass Effect 3 with a wife and a kid after you romanced him in Mass Effect 2 makes more sense than that line of dialogue from Sentinel Dax. It's not just bad, it's lazy, and it's not just lazy, it's offensively, defiantly lazy. It's written by a writer who couldn't be bothered to come up with a better premise or a better logical progression for their plot, and then has the audacity, the unmitigated gall, to flaunt this fact in your face, and then tepidly attempt to cover up for their own ineptitude with a stupid joke. Oh, har har har, isn't it funny how even I don't know what's going on or why? What garbage. It sounds like a writer having a conversation with themselves about how bad of a writer they are. The plot of this quest at this point isn't even a mystery at all. Mysteries aren't just confused nonsense. A mystery is where information is given to the player or viewer or reader in a way that makes sense, except for one or two pieces always missing that keeps it from fully coming together. This quest is no information, barely even a premise, followed by non sequiturs, and then finally a direct slap in the face, tantamount to the writer telling the player, I don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on, no one knows what's going on, you're not supposed to know what's going on, and isn't it all just so mysterious and oh so hilarious? Rarely do I get this upset about something in a game, but this instance of bad writing takes the shit crown in the entire pantheon of BioWare missteps. Anthem is, at times, a competently written game, don't get me wrong, but this specific quest and these specific lines of dialogue, and Dax generally, is an example of writing that makes people say things like, the old BioWare we once knew is dead. For all the vague criticisms of Anthem's story, no one else has harped on this. In all of the YouTube coverage that I've watched, and believe me, I've watched a lot, I haven't seen anyone else specifically call out this quest and this character and this dialogue. Which oddly begs the question, for those that didn't like Anthem's story in general, which part of it do you think is seriously worse than this? Because Anthem does have really competent moments of writing. Some moments aren't just competent, they're even really, really good. For instance, there's a scene that I quite like between all the major actors. It's right after the team meets with the regulators. Halleck, Faye, the freelancer, and Owen are all on board the Strider trying to figure out how to get it running again and what they need to do next in general. There aren't necessarily any major plot developments in this scene, but it sets up the middle portion of the story really well and establishes some of the core character dynamics in a succinct and subtle way. In particular, Halleck, Faye, and the freelancer have a unique dynamic between the three of them that is expertly put on screen here. Halleck is struggling to redeem himself, and the freelancer is uniquely positioned to help him, in part due to prior work and familiarity, but also because emotionally, he's been through much the same thing that Halleck has. When the freelancer is helping Halleck by handing him tools, it's subtly communicated, I know what needs to be done, I'm technically competent, but also, I know you're sort of at your wit's end, I'm here to help. Halleck is reluctant because of his pride, and probably because he doesn't want to get anyone else hurt, and Faye is probably the only one who really understands that. Faye is the patient one of the three, understanding of both the rational and emotional needs, and trying to mend those things together at a pace that's okay for everyone. The physical cues in this scene are subtle but telling. As I mentioned, the freelancer being ready to hand Halleck tools a second after he asks denotes the familiarity and a willingness to assist. Halleck is reluctant and maybe even a little annoyed at how well this dynamic still works, but deep down, he's probably also a little relieved that there's still a chance that they can do this if they pull together. This little mini project of getting the Strider working is a great example of using a physical problem to demonstrate a more emotional tension. It shows that they can still be a good team, even if they do have some issues. Faye actually having to add a final touch to the repairs after Halleck leaves is another great touch, hinting at what becomes more and more clear as the story goes on, that perhaps Faye is what's holding it all together really. This scene also sets up Owen's place in the group dynamic, which is conspicuously not great. Owen is the new cipher for the freelancer, where once it was Faye, and it's clear that he's struggling to feel at home now that the freelancer is back with his old friends. In hindsight, it can even be taken as some light foreshadowing for how Owen just really isn't a part of this team, despite the fact that on some level he desperately wants to be. From a plot and exposition standpoint, it establishes the aim of needing to find Helena Tarsis' original gear in order to face the Heart of Rage. This aim is primarily what composes a lot of the lead-up to the finale. It's exposition, sure, but the exposition is woven in so seamlessly and so thoroughly with character progression that it hardly feels like exposition at all. This is a short, well-constructed scene that achieves multiple necessary tasks for the story, but feels naturalistic and organic. Scenes like this rarely get attention because they don't have plot twists or character depth or big emotional monologues, but they are really hard to get right and especially necessary to set up other parts of character growth and plot later on. As a writer and a story nerd, I love when these scenes are done right. Another scene I quite like was the scene right before the final mission, when you give Faye the seal fragment needed to finish the Dawn Shield. This is another example of a well-written scene, especially showing how Faye has been affected by everything and how the freelancer relates to her. There's an earnestness to Faye's performance that is as good or better than any that I've seen in BioWare games. It's a combination of the writing and the acting, but something about Faye feels almost too naturalistic for a BioWare game in a good way. She doesn't feel like she's dispensing information about herself or the plot, but like she's actually searching for how she feels in that moment. She's also a great way to gain insight into Halleck, a character who, by his nature, may not share so freely about himself. This is a good device to use in order to help keep Halleck's nature intact, but still getting to learn more about him as a person. And it also allows us to see more of Faye's nature as a caring friend. Her guilt and concern is palpable, which makes her excitement about the chances of success that much more endearing. Faye seems to genuinely care, and that makes it easier for you to care about her. There are other good scenes, obviously, in particular during the opening and closing of the game, but I like to point out these two in particular because I feel that they're easily overlooked. In the coming months and maybe years, we're probably going to see lots more story from Anthem. This game, more than any other in BioWare's catalog, has been built as a live service, so while story DLC is nothing new, the rhetoric from BioWare suggests something more regular and small to medium-sized as far as story content. We still don't know exactly what that will look like, but hopefully it's character-focused, naturalistic in its dialogue, and gives more chance for player interaction in the story. These are things that can absolutely be improved in any future story content. I'd also like to see more of Halleck and Faye. From the very onset of describing this game as a story-driven live service, BioWare has teased the concept for giving us more content around a particular character if they were popular enough. And the consensus seems clear: Halleck and Faye are the clear favorites. I'd like to know more about Halleck's past and maybe his future. I'd similarly like to know more of Faye's backstory and get more opportunities to spend time getting to know her. Cassin I thought was intriguing and just needed more time on screen, so maybe some story DLC could expound upon her character further. Alternatively, beyond just character-focused content, I wonder if BioWare might do something unprecedented and actively try to fix some of the structural things lacking in the main story of the Critical Path. That's a trickier thing to do post-launch, but not impossible. Adding more content in the second act could help resolve the lack of conflict, and adding more dialogue for the freelancer in particular during those sections could help flesh out more of the backstory for the player character. It's a tall order to try and retroactively fix things like that, but if story games as a service are really going to distinguish themselves as offering unique value, options like that have to at least be on the table. Since 2017, when Anthem was first revealed at E3, I've said a lot about its potential to tell a good story. I've mainly always leaned towards the skeptical side, and I've appropriately lowered my expectations considerably coming into this experience. I'm amazed at how much those expectations were surpassed, and thoroughly impressed BioWare managed to get this much BioWare-ness into a genre that seems categorically opposed to lengthy conversations, deep lore, and player-driven choice. No, it's not up to par in terms of role-playing or branching story that we have seen in prior BioWare titles, but it's also a high point in many other ways. The combat and traversal, for instance, are better than in any other BioWare game ever. This is the best combat loop they have ever made. It's a near-perfect 10 seconds of fun, repeated on a loop, that has been the secret sauce of so many wildly successful games in the past. And traversal in a BioWare game has never been this good. So much of the problems in Inquisition were around the world being so big and the movement being so boring. Andromeda remedied that slightly with a solid driving gameplay in the Nomad, but that's nothing compared to the fun of flying around Anthem's world in a Javelin. The point of this video was to critically examine Anthem as a piece of storytelling, and in doing that, I have an obligation to take apart all the pieces and examine them with as much objectivity as I can muster. But that isn't the same as a subjective feeling of enjoyment. I enjoyed the heck out of Anthem, and I'm still enjoying it. It's been my most played game over the past 2 weeks, and I've had way more positive things to say about it than I ever would have anticipated. So if I sound down or negative about the game, please realize that's just me with my critic's hat on. As a BioWare fan, I quite like this game, albeit not as much as I liked any of the Dragon Age or Mass Effect games. On a recent livestream and podcast, I described Anthem in much that way. If you're a longtime BioWare fan, you'll probably be surprised how much you like Anthem. But most likely, you won't love Anthem. Make of that what you will. Anthem is a game that has a big premise at its core. Big and broad and classical, it's an attempt, maybe more so than any of BioWare's other games, to shoot straight at the heart of classical storytelling, to tell a quintessential tale. But it's disjointed in its attempt, discordant and incongruent. I hate to frame my criticism in a way that could be taken as divisive, but as I played Anthem and as I wrote the analysis for this video, I could not help but shake the feeling that there were two groups in BioWare. Those that wanted a classic quintessential hero's tale, and those that wanted something else. Something more novel, more catchy, more quirky. What we're left with is a foundation, a premise, and lots of lore that is promising material for a classic hero's journey, but dialogue and plot that are unspecific, meandering, and lacking conviction. There's some good, strong writing in Anthem, characters that will stick with you, and themes that are worth writing about. But there's also lots of bad writing, characters that are self-serving, and dialogue that's vapid and tone-deaf. BioWare missed too many opportunities with Anthem's story. They squandered the potential of this premise, these themes, and a couple of great characters. Despite everything they did do well, I can't honestly tell you that you would be missing much from the story of Anthem if you skipped this one. Now, as a whole, given how unique the combat is, how fun the gameplay loops are, I'd recommend you check it out. It's truly a unique entry into this genre, despite what some are saying. But for the first time ever, I can't recommend a BioWare game just on the basis of its story. Anthem's story, at its core, is a quintessential tale of heroism, and in some sense, needs a direct approach of dudes in jetpack armor, blowing stuff up and being badass. But it also needs some earnestness, about friends helping each other out. It needs to clearly espouse the old-fashioned values of self-sacrifice. It needs sharp, poignant, naturalistic dialogue. And it also needs a clear, well-conceived, and multifaceted villain. In the end, Anthem got very little of what it needed, and way too much of what it didn't. This has been The Exalted March, a conversation about storytelling and design in video games. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, and if you'd like to be kept aware of all future content, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you have your own thoughts on Anthem, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to know what you think. I also do a bi-weekly podcast with fellow YouTuber Gilder Thalin, where we discuss all things BioWare. You can follow me on Twitter also for a random smattering of video game related thoughts at The Exalted March. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been The Exalted March.